I think the most important thing is for all of us to acknowledge that there are infinitely more things we do not know than what we do know, and that it is impossible for any human to know and understand everything. If all Christians could just humble themselves and admit that, we would be very close to being able to come together and unite. Most likely, the exact meaning and purpose of Jesus' words about his body and blood are something none of us will ever know in this life. Apparently, it is something we are not meant to completely understand. In every academic area, humans know more now than they did in the first few centuries. This is in line with the concept of God's progressive revelation. Just because a belief is old or ancient does not necessarily mean that belief is true. As an example, most likely all of the people in the first few centuries believed the earth was flat, but we all now know that belief is not true. Most likely, all the people in the first few centuries were just as mystified as people in the last few centuries about the exact meaning of Jesus' declaration about his body and blood at the Last Supper. The disciples witnessed Jesus making that declaration, but that does not mean they understood what the declaration meant. The probability of any of us knowing what really happened in the past depends upon how far back we go in time. The farther back we go, the less certain we can be about what really happened. The past is just as mysterious as the future. Yes, there are historical documents, but they may represent only the view of the author of those documents, or they may contain errors. At the Last Supper, as Jesus held up the bread and wine, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." In other words, it's like tying a string around your finger or like making a note in your calendar, something you do to make sure you remember something. Most of Jesus' followers were uneducated, and nearly everyone took his words literally, even when he clearly did not intend for them to be taken literally. For example, Jesus talked about being born again or being born a second time. His followers could not understand how a person could go back into the womb and be born a second time. Jesus talked about tearing down the temple and it would be rebuilt in 3 days. They all believed he was talking about the literal temple. Nobody apparently understood that he was referring to his body and the resurrection because none of them expected him to be resurrected. And all of them were surprised and shocked when he appeared to them after he was resurrected. It appears there were all kinds of things his followers did not know and understand. So it's no surprise that when Jesus held up the bread and wine and said, "This is my body and this is my blood," um, that they took it literally, even if Jesus did not mean for it to be taken literally. And it's no surprise that many of the authorities in the early Christian church also took it literally. There are many instances where Jesus said things that we now know were not to be taken literally. If you believe the bread and wine are the literal body and blood of Christ, that's okay. Or if you believe the bread and wine represent the body and blood of Christ, that's okay too. What difference does it make? If all Christians stop making it an issue, maybe then we could be more accepting of each other. It need not be a matter of A and not B, or B and not A. It seems to me that ought to be fairly easily acceptable to all Christians because neither group has to really give up anything. All that has to be given up is the attitude that one group is right and everyone who doesn't agree with that group is wrong. Contrary to what Martin Luther has stated, if you or I were in the same position as Jesus and said, "This is my body and this is my blood," and meant for it to be taken symbolically, it would not be normal or natural for us to say, "This bread is a symbol or sign of my body, and this wine is a symbol or sign of my blood." The natural and normal thing to say would be, "This is my body and this is my blood," as you held up the bread and wine. Here are a couple of examples that illustrate this fact. When you look at a map, you say things like, "This is Oak Street," and that is Bridge Street. You do not say, "This line is a representation of Oak Street, and that line is a representation of Bridge Street." Saying that is awkward and unnatural, and nobody would say that. Or if you look at a picture or drawing of, say, your house, you would normally say, "That is my house." You would not say that is a picture or representation or drawing of my house. Or if you look at a picture of your family, you would say, "That is my mother, that is my father, that is my sister," etc. You would not say, "That is a picture or representation of my mother," etc. So the argument by Martin Luther suggesting that Jesus would say, the wine is a sign of my body, etc., is certainly not a valid argument against a symbolic interpretation of the Lord's Supper. If Martin Luther's argument were valid, then one should ask, why didn't Jesus say, I am symbolically the vine, and you are symbolically the branches? Or, the temple symbol which represents my body will be torn down and rebuilt in 3 days. Or, I am symbolically the door. To the best of my knowledge, he never stated the symbols he used were symbols ever. We all ought to understand that God is above and beyond human understanding, and humans cannot fully comprehend God or God's kingdom. That's why Jesus said things like, the kingdom of God is like ... knowing no finite human could comprehend the infinite. There would be no communication without symbols. Sounds are symbols that represent something else. Letters and alphabets are symbols. Words are symbols that represent some type of meaning. Most likely, no spiritual reality can be communicated without the use of symbols, at least not in this life. The Bible is filled with symbols and symbolism, and it needs to be that way. Otherwise, nothing would be communicated to us. Of all the numerous things Jesus said that we now know are not to be taken literally, why do we choose one of them and say that one ought to be interpreted literally? Why not choose some other one or all the other ones? The reasons why I believe what I believe do not depend on what the church fathers believed. I look at the universe and our own planet, all of the creatures and their intelligence, and cannot believe they came into existence from a random process. Reasoning itself is not a random process. I believe there had to be a designer or creator. I look at reasoning and logic, and logic tells me if there is any meaning to anything, then I must be able to know something. I look at history, and there is too much evidence to support the historicity of Jesus for me to deny it. And Bible seems to be trustworthy and records that Jesus claimed to be God, so I must accept it. The story of the Bible is relatively easy to understand. We are sinners, and God sacrificed himself to save us, and I believe it. None of these things have anything to do with first, second, or third century Christian beliefs other than what is stated in the Bible. Most likely, many early Christians did take the body and blood language literally, which is understandable. In my opinion, it makes no difference if one takes it literally or symbolically. If the salvation of your soul does not depend upon what you believe about the Eucharist or communion, then what difference does it make whether you take it literally or figuratively? With respect to the statements made by the Church Fathers, we do not have enough information to really know how to correctly interpret them with any degree of confidence. For example, what do we know about the culture at that time in those places? What do we know about what was politically correct to say in their day and age? How do we know if what they stated in documents is really what they honestly believed, or was it said to comply with some other authority? It was so far back in time that we cannot be too certain about anything regarding those statements. I would like to see all existing documents about the Eucharist or communion that were authored in the first few centuries put into a searchable database, and then have the best Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and other biblical scholars debate what they believe Jesus meant when he declared the bread and wine were his body and blood. I believe the opinions will be more alike than they will be different, and could form the basis of an eventual consensus between all Christians. In my opinion, many Christian authorities are not being open and honest about the true nature of the evidence for and against transubstantiation. If the evidence for and against transubstantiation were placed on a fair scale, the evidence against it would probably be about equal to the evidence for it. Plus, this has been a disputed issue from the first century. In arguments and debates, parties only cite facts that support their position, but in this matter, we need to cite all of the facts in order to be fair to all parties. God is omnipresent, so he is in the Eucharist or communion, as well as everywhere else all the time. He is in the bread, and he is in the wine. These facts may help unite all Christians regarding beliefs about the Eucharist or communion. It's interesting that I made this statement before I saw that Huldrych Zwingli had said the same thing 500 years ago.